How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most haziest podcast in the world. We're your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the Genre Essentials, where we talk about some essential albums in a specific genre of music. In this case, we're going to be talking about one that we've been pretty excited to do, and it's yours truly's favorite genre of all time, Shoegaze. And this one's going to be a very interesting one. We've got... I think we've chosen a decent list that has roots in the 90s, but also has a lot of stuff that comes from the 2000s and the 2010s. So I think we have a decent variety of stuff here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of iconic stuff here, but also a lot of pretty interesting kind of niche stuff here to talk about as well. So, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Alright, so first album we're going to be talking about is Nowhere by Ride, which came out in 1990. This is the debut album from Oxford band Ride. Of course, it was released in October of 1990 under Creation Records. That being a particular frontrunner in promoting some of the most essential and groundbreaking shoegaze bands ever. Before Ride and many other bands that came along, there was a lot of stuff that came out in the 80s that was kind of proto-shoegaze in a way. A lot of bands that you see in like the gothic rock scenes and the noise rock scenes and indie rock and dream pop, and they were like birthing sounds and ideas that would be definitive to shoegaze. But it wasn't until the 90s where it kind of fully developed and became its own thing. And Ride were one of the earliest and most popular frontrunners of the sound, and in that realm of bands, Ride stand out a lot as their own unique strain of the sound. I know a lot of people like question whether they actually are shoegaze or not, but I guess what they toyed with and what they're presenting on this very album, I think, is a strong case for their place in the shoegaze canon. Nowhere has a lot of elements that we see in your contemporary shoegaze aesthetics. It's pure noise and ethereal atmospherics blend together into this very harsh yet psychedelic texture. But Ride's twist on it has much more of an energetic and percussive edge to it, with a fair amount of tracks that have this momentum to them that never really lets up on the energy. But in between, there's tracks that for sure fit the description for conventional shoegaze. In that regard, Ride, Nowhere isn't exactly the shoegaze you would expect to hear if you're already familiar with bands like My Bloody Valentine and Slowdive, but even then, it's still a very interesting album to talk about, and it was a difficult one to go over for me, given how, I suppose, non-shoegaze yet shoegaze it was. Even then, I really love this album. I think it's great, and I love a lot of things about it. For one, the band's energy and sense of melody really shines through in the energetic haze that this album resides in. I love the guitar work, I love the vocals. The drumming from Loz Colbert is fantastic on here. And there's tracks on here that are just peak music for me. I will get to them in a minute. Honestly, I don't really have much to criticize it in terms of production or like individual songs, since they just sound fantastic on their own. It may somewhat blend together at points, but I really can't complain when so many of the songs hit for me. And I'll just shut up for now and let you talk about it.
At its core, I think Nowhere is essentially a musical hybrid of the music that had been coming out of Britain over the course of the 80s. There's plenty of subtle nods to like the Stone Roses, the Smiths, the Jesus and Mary chain, all throughout this project's DNA. But what really set this album apart at the time, and still does, is it just the very familiar yet just at the time quite new wall of sound, the haze that surrounded this album's just foundations. It really did set the groundwork for a lot of bands that would go on to become massive shoegaze staples in the 90s, while at the same time still very much holding on to a lot of its 80s influences. It does kind of feel like a bridge of sorts from non-shoegaze to shoegaze in a sense. And in my opinion, Nowhere is just as important to the foundation of shoegaze as albums like Isn't Anything or Psycho. I almost said Psychology. Psycho Candy. It's a perfect example of like the early development of shoegaze, and it's a perfect example of how a sound as familiar and comforting as the one presented here can still be elevated to new horizons with the help of a few pedals. There's something just so pure, so joyous about Nowhere. Unlike an album like Loveless, for example, where the wall of sound is just so dense, the soundscapes feel just meticulously planned out. To me, it feels like Ride almost stumbled upon, the sound they present here. It's almost amateurish. Its arrangements are just a lot less meticulous, but through and through, I still think that this kind of carefree, just blissful nature and atmosphere really does work with the sound of the album. Like a lot of shoegaze, Nowhere is just a transcendental journey. It's an album to lose yourself in, and in my opinion, it's kind of a perfect gateway into shoegaze as it brings forward everything I love about the genre in a package that is never really challenging to listen to. It's never overwhelming. It is familiar, as it does, kind of take influence from a lot of familiar genres. It's just simply blissful from start to finish. The guitar work is stellar, and as I previously mentioned, the wall of sound, it feels more like a subtle, comforting fog rather than a just, overwhelming entity on the project. I will, obviously mention best tracks in a second, but I do specifically have to bring up Vaporwave because it's a song that has rightfully so kind of carved out its name in shoegaze folklore. It is one of the most magical moments of the 90s. It is that track alone, I think, is worth checking out this project for. And I felt like I had to give it an individual kind of moment of appreciation.
All right, now we can move on to best tracks. My favorite tracks were Seagull, Kaleidoscope, and Dreams Burn Down. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are Seagull, In a Different Place, and Vapor Trail. My least favorite track, I guess if I had to pick, was Paralyzed, but that track is solid as well.
Yeah.
Now we move on to a little known album. It's called Loveless, and it's by My Bloody Valentine. Loveless is the second studio album by Irish band My Bloody Valentine, having been released 3 years after the band's highly influential debut album Isn't Anything, an album that some people view as kind of the first true shoegaze album. And Loveless has over the years gone on to become one of the most iconic albums of all time, even outside of the shoegaze genre. And it's about time I get to talk about my favorite album of all time on this channel.
I don't think you have ever on the podcast.
No, well, I guess on the streams briefly when we listen to.
Definitely on the streams, not on the not on like an individual podcast episode. For those listening, get your popcorn out. This will be a while.
I'll keep it relatively brief. As I said, this is my favorite album of all time. And I don't think you really forget your first time, listening to your first album, regardless of what it is. And for me, this was no exception. I still remember the scene vividly. I was around 15. I was doing my Irish homework, and I was like, fuck it, I'll put on some tunes. I had this random ass book that was, the 1001 albums you must hear before you die book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just fucking flicking through that. I was kind of going through the 90s because at that point I was like a Nirvana head, so I love the 90s. And I liked the cover, so I clicked on it. And, from the first time I hit play on Only Shallow, I was just hooked. By the time the album was over, I was just lying in my bed staring at the ceiling. I felt like I was on an acid trip. It was the first time that I ever heard music that was able to just, transport you into just a different dimension. It was immediately I my music taste was a little more sheltered back then, but I was immediately like, this is fucking special, and to this day I haven't looked back. From the opening drum beat of Only Shallow to the fading guitar patterns at the last few seconds of Soon, this is an album that demands every single fiber of your attention, yet it also doesn't require much for you to give it that. It's just such a dense, such a magical journey that is just, it just grabs you and it transports you, and you just pretty much have no say in it. Despite at the time of its release the genre of shoegaze not being very well traveled, even to this day there still is nothing quite like Loveless. Nothing quite like shoegaze. There's nothing quite like Loveless. This album kind of has carved out its own, well, I guess technically this band has kind of carved out its own niche sound within the shoegaze sphere. It's just the guitars throughout here just build up and collapse on one another and just form one enormous unit of noise, just beautiful, grandiose, and perfectly assembled noise. Yet it's noise that is so overbearing and powerful that I don't think no other band in the early stages of shoegaze were, I guess, brave enough to, attempt to just tame and mold these just distorted, just incredibly dense textures into something like this, something so beautiful. What you see in a lot of early shoegaze is, the kind of pop foundations are very clearly aligned there, and the more shoegazy wall of noise is kind of a bit of an ornament throughout the album, whereas they just, Belinda Butcher and Kevin Shields are fucking wizards. The noises that they make on this album using guitars just should never have been possible, and it's just something that I guess before 1991 it would have been ridiculous to think that you could make a beautiful sounding album using so much just distortion and noise and just textures, but they somehow managed to almost tame the untamable. I can talk about this album for forever, but I will give Mick the microphone. I'll just close off with this statement. It's still hard for me to believe that this album exists. It just checks every box that I would have ever wanted in an album. It checks a bunch of boxes that I didn't even know an album could check. It's a masterpiece. It's still to this day a one-of-a-kind album, and it's perfect from first, second to last. And When You Sleep is like the pinnacle of shoegaze. So
about fucking time.
Nick,
all right.
Go ahead.
Loveless is far and away the most critically acclaimed and beloved shoegaze album, and it's the album that practically defines shoegaze, and the band behind it are seen as the most essential and pioneering band in the genre. Bonus points because they're Irish too. Well, hey! It's hard to even say anything new about Loveless, since what's been said about it is more or less said by everyone, and your spiel there was pretty much on point, but that's besides the point. It's basically like this because, what's said about this album is true, and it's acclaimed for a reason. It's just that amazing, and it's just such a fucking trip from start to finish. A noisy, feedback-driven, and hazy trip. The sound of Loveless is honestly just otherworldly, and there's not really another album in this vein that's able to perfectly encapsulate a hazy, noisy atmosphere like Loveless does. It's incredibly dense, its sonic textures are insane, its walls of haze and noise are intoxicating, and the way that the band blend their vocals, melodies, and instrumentation with this thick wall of noisy bliss is just nothing short of unreal. It's insane to think that layers of guitar feedback, effects, and noise can make for some of the most lush, ethereal, and just beautiful soundscapes you will ever hear on an album. And on top of that, each track is just so engrossing and intoxicating that as soon as you turn it on, you sure as fuck are not going to turn it off, because it just fucking reels you in as soon as the opening track just roars at you. It is insane. Each time I listen to this album, I'm left in awe, and I'm just left questioning how the fuck anyone could have made this. It's insane, and it makes for an unbelievable experience that has some unbelievable tracks. It's a trance-inducing album, and for me, I could finally call it a masterpiece, really. I've been putting it off for too long, but it's honestly a 10 for me.
Fuck yes.
Yeah, I loved it already, but I just grew to love it more. So much that, it's ranking as one of my favorites of all time. And for sure, it's far and away the best shoegaze album ever made, in my opinion. And there's albums that have definitely come close, but they've never beaten Loveless. No chance. And that's not to discredit all the other amazing shoegaze out there, but when it comes to Loveless, there's just nothing I can really criticize it for. There isn't even a single track that's lackluster or underwhelming. It's just fantastic for me. I love it. I have no more words for it. It's pretty much a given that this is an essential shoegaze album, and it's just pure brilliance in sonic form. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks are, well, they're all of them, but some select favorites: Only Shallow, To Hear Knows When You Sleep, and Blown a Wish. I have no least favorites.
I managed to narrow it down to 3. Isn't that impressive?
Woo! Finally.
To Hear Knows When You Sleep, and Soon. Obviously no least favorites.
That's a given with this album.
Yeah.
Okay, we're moving on to the third album on our list, and it is Dynamo by Soda Stereo. This is the sixth album from famed Argentine pop rock and alternative rock band Soda Stereo. It came out in 1992, and it was released under Sony Music. I think it's also important to note that Soda Stereo was fronted by the late Gustavo Cerati, who has some really essential solo records that are really great that I would recommend. Bocanada especially is a great album that I'd encourage y'all to listen to. But I digress. Back to Dynamo. From what I've seen online before this album was made, Soda Stereo were mainly in like an accessible like pop rock sound, and this sound was a huge turning point for the band since they began to experiment with sonic textures and ideas that are primarily in shoegaze, neo-psychedelia, and even baggy. It's seen as the band's most experimental album by many in that regard, but as an album itself, I think it's pretty damn great. And the more I listen to it, I think I really enjoyed it each time I came away from it. I thoroughly enjoy it, anyway, is what I meant to say. Soda Stereo borrow a lot from shoegaze sonically. There's plenty of tones and atmospheres that fit the bill for that sound. It's lush, it's ethereal, it's psychedelic, and it's warm. And throughout the album, the band hits you with a diverse set of ideas that can range from just sticky pop-tinged tracks to psychedelic jams and tracks that have a bit of a dance vibe to them. They're tied together in this shoegaze sound, and for me at least, I really dig a lot of the moments on here for the way they sound and how engaging they are because of the variety that's on here. Cerati's vocals are fantastic in this sonic palette, and the melodies hit home very well with a lot of cuts here. There's so many catchy tracks with great vocals on them. Its only real issue is that it kind of blends together towards the end, but even then those songs are still pretty good, and there's plenty of great material on this album. It's essential for the fact that it's one of those interesting cases where a band managed to encapsulate the essence of shoegaze so well while also being diverse and adding to the sound, and also because some non-English speaking shoegaze is a cool thing to add to your list. All in all, Dynamo is a really great record for me. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've come away enjoying it every single time that I've went back to it, and yeah, it's essential.
Fuck yeah. Soda Stereo were pretty much as well travelled as a band could be genre-wise over their short 11-year stint. They started off as a very kind of ska-influenced new wave band, then they eventually transitioned into just more, traditional 80s new wave. Then they kind of did some hard rock and alternative rock at the start of the 90s before, finally landing on the shoegaze sound present on Dynamo. A sound they actually only really explored on this album before transitioning into like a art rock style on their final album, Sueno Stereo. So the term musical chameleon was kind of made for bands like this, and they, over their career kind of adapted to the sounds that were happening in the world around them. And to be honest, I think it's a real shame that the band didn't really explore this kind of shoegaze style a little more, because honestly they're absolute naturals at it. Similarly to Ride, I think the core building blocks of this project were in a genre most would have been kind of very familiar with in the early 90s, just alternative rock, as well as a bit of a Matt Chester kind of baggy influence. And, just like Ride, Soda Stereo add layers of just noise and haze to that sound to very great effect. I think this album is very warm, it's very playful, it's hypnotic, it's everything you would want from a shoegaze record. But I will say, unfortunately, it does, to me, sound a little kind of safe. But I don't think that it takes away from the album's clear proficiency in creating just a very dynamic shoegaze style. And while it doesn't really explore the depths of the genre, I think that the sound that they do present on here is very refined, very clean, and just very easy to listen to and enjoy. It's still a very damn good shoegaze project, and it's not hard for me to see why it does get the praise it does. But for me, I guess it was just kind of one of the it's not one of the most exciting albums of the 90s shoegaze era, which ultimately is not saying much because that period in time was just insane for shoegaze. But I still think it's a project you should definitely check out, especially like you said. It's one of the few non-English shoegaze albums of the early 90s. And it's definitely still a sound that is an album that is reminiscent of kind of the golden era of shoegaze. But yeah, it's a great album. It's kind of unlucky that this album's kind of sandwiched between two absolute Goliaths in the genre, and it's also unlucky that the band didn't really want to explore this sound any further, because I think they could have done really great things.
Probably. I suppose the album flopped when it came out commercially, so that's probably why they kind of stayed away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, best and worst tracks. My favorite tracks from Dynamo are Toma la Ruta, Camaleon, and Luna Roja. My least favorite track is Fue.
My favorite tracks are Primavera Zero, Chameleon, and Luna Rojo. My least favorite track is Sweet Sahumerio. I should add, I woke up at 6 a.m. today to go to work, and I'm just home.
Imagine working, God.
My brain's a little fried. But we move on to Souvlaki by Slowdive.
Hey.
Souvlaki is the sophomore studio album by English band Slowdive, released in 1993. It has gone on to be known as one of the three staple albums of 90s shoegaze, along with Loveless, of course, and Rides Nowhere. And this album is absolutely mesmerizing. Souvlaki sounds like the musical equivalent of, that state you're in when you're falling in and out of sleep constantly on like a weekend morning when you can't afford to stay in bed. It's somewhere between dreamy and melancholy ambience and just sunny and blissful catharsis. It's definitely a magical album, and just like all shoegaze tends to be a magical experience. Somewhere among Souvlaki's harsh yet beautifully dense soundscapes lies what is essentially just an incredible pop record in of itself. But what Slowdive managed to craft on here in terms of the aforementioned soundscapes is just truly unique and really, really powerful. Souvlaki sets itself apart from other iconic shoegaze albums by virtue of just sheer hypnotic nature of its compositions. The Wall of Sounds is just more like a mural of sound, as it presents just different textures, different just magical, and everything just kind of works like a jigsaw puzzle on here of just ethereal atmosphere and harsh textures. Everything combines in a way that is just so meticulous and in a way so unorthodox that it really is quite mesmerizing. It manages to combine just so many musical textures that would, in a vacuum, you wouldn't really imagine that they would sound so beautiful and so transcendental together. Tracks like Allison and When the Sun Hits are just life-affirmingly beautiful. Then there's tracks like Machine Gun and Souvlaki Space Station that are just like musical hypnosis, basically. The whole album takes risks musically, but it's just really hard to see them as risks because of just how perfectly everything complements each other on this project. Just like Loveless, I feel like there really is no album quite like Souvlaki. Just like My Bloody Valentine, I think Slowdive really carved out their own unique space within the shoegaze world, and it's not easy to see why they're held to almost the same high level of praise as My Bloody Valentine, because they are a very, very special band in every sense of the word. So yeah, mic drop.
All right, picked it back up again. Yeah, Souvlaki.
Sorry about that.
Well, why would you do that? Fuck. Anyways.
We need to work on the relay.
Really? No, that's bad. Bad acting aside, let's just talk about Souvlaki. Woo! Yeah, another massive staple in the shoegaze genre, and for good reason, because this album really just thrives in everything that can make a shoegaze album amazing, and it shows in almost every single way all over this album's track list. I mean, if you ask anybody who knows their shoegaze, most of the time, Souvlaki will be one of the albums that they mention, and it would honestly feel like a crime to not mention it in this list, because it really is that important to shoegaze, and as a whole, it's just that good. This is far and away one of the most beautiful and ethereal albums I've ever heard. I won't sugarcoat it. It's also a fairly depressing album too, given the mood of the album, and obviously the lyrical content. It's incredibly melancholic in that regard, and that melancholy is just perfectly shown to the listener in the mood and the sound of this thing. It sounds immaculate. The production is just incredible. Slowdive pushed what they could do for shoegaze and made an album that perfectly encapsulates pure mood while writing songs that are just timeless and amazing underneath the overwhelming atmosphere and noise. Souvlaki is fairly diverse in what it tries to do. Like, you'll get songs that have amazing pop tunes at the core, then there's your sad ballad type tracks, and there's tracks that are just solely about the atmosphere and how they develop, and in turn that just makes for a lot of very hypnotic and just trance-inducing tracks. It just makes for a really interesting and unique listen as it goes on, and from the very iconic start with Alison, it just hooks you in until the very end. And there's some amazing tracks in this thing. Some of the best shoegaze tracks of all time are on this thing. Basically they're tracks that nail every synonym associated with shoegaze, and it just shows the sound at its most trance-inducing, in my opinion. There's plenty of tracks that I love on this thing. I will get to them in best or worst tracks. There's barely a moment that feels weak on here, and if you haven't listened to it yet, then I don't know what to tell you. Just go fucking listen to it already, jeez. And with that in mind, best and worst tracks. My favorite tracks are Alison, 40 Days, and When the Sun Hits. If I had to pick a least favorite, I would go with All Together.
My favorite tracks are Alison, Machine Gun, and When the Sun Hits. My least favorite track is Melon Yellow, if I had to pick, really.
Alright, we're moving on to our 5th edition so far? Yes?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. A Storm in Heaven by The Verve. This is the 1993 debut album from Manchester-based neo-psych and more famously Britpop band The Verve, which was released under Hot Records. The Verve are a band that are for sure more famous for being part of the 90s Britpop wave and for their most popular track, Bittersweet Symphony. And from the beginning of their career, they've had that neo-psych flair to their music while incorporating subtle elements of space rock into their sound. But their debut also happens to incorporate some elements of shoegaze into their sound with that. And The Verve came out with a debut that has some pretty interesting blends and ideas. Personally, I do think the album is a tad bit flawed, but it's still a very good album and is worthy of being noted as an essential shoegaze album for me. I think it's a really pleasant and enjoyable album from front to back. I think that it really has some great things about it, like the tight instrumentation. I like how the latter half dwells into some ideas, and the instrumentation that feels a bit more meticulous is fantastic on here. Plus, the general sound of this thing is really great from a production standpoint. It has some sonic blends that are unique, and that gives this album a bit of an interesting edge to what's going on, and the way that they blend make for a pretty cool combo that's very well respected for the genre's strengths. There's some really great tracks to be found in here. I think that it's an enjoyable listen from front to back. There's plenty of great tracks on here. Of course, I'll just move on to the main criticisms I have for it, and the main one is mainly down for the pacing. I think it thrives on a lot of fronts, but the pacing generally towards the end is kind of what slows it down for me, and at that point, I guess it just feels way too slow, in my opinion. Like, it makes the album a bit too slow, should I say. Like, I get why it's the way it is, and I won't slate it, because a lot of the tracks on the back end are still really solid, but it can be a little too slow for my liking, personally. Aside from that, though, it's still a really good album. It's pretty unique, and all in all, yeah, that's it.
This is going to be a little monotonous, because you pretty much said everything that I would say. So I'll try to keep things brief. One thing that stayed consistent for the Verve, whether it be Britpop or shoegaze, their sound always remained fascinatingly psychedelic, and that's exactly what you can expect from this project. A shoegaze album that's kind of rooted in neo psychedelia and space rock. Storm in Heaven is like a densely ethereal fever dream. It's cold. It's isolated, it's melancholy, it's also at the same time very hypnotically beautiful. The aforementioned space rock elements add a very unique charm to the album as well, when combined with everything else I mentioned. This album kind of serves almost as a shoegaze soundtrack to some distant wintry planet. So while atmosphere is something this album absolutely does get right, I also do have a major gripe with this project, and that is definitely that it is incredibly front-loaded. I don't think there's any, straight-up bad material on the latter half of this project, but it really just kind of meanders and pales in comparison to the first half of the album. I feel like this album just kind of plays all its best cards early and then just kind of stays there in a state of just, I wouldn't say disrepair, but like lack of any, incentive to progress or do anything new with its sound. So I mean, I still think that this is a very good album, and I can see why it's very highly regarded in the shoegaze community. But when you do think of highlight tracks in this album, you do mostly think of tracks that appear on the first half. So there is that.
That it?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, moving on to best to worst tracks. Favorite tracks from A Storm in Heaven are Star Sail, Butterfly, and See You in the Next One, Have a Good Time. Least favorite track would probably be Blue.
My favorite tracks are Slide Away, Already There, and The Sun, the Sea. My least favorite track is also Blue. Now, we're still on 1993, and we're on to Mezcal, the sophomore studio album from English band Swervedriver, released again in 1993 on Creation Record, a record label that notoriously put out some incredible shoegaze album. I forgot to mention them when talking about the likes of Loveless and Souvlaki, but here they are again.
I briefly mentioned them at the start, so
I didn't though. You did your work. Anyways,
see, I did my
instrumentally,
homework.
I think Mezcal is one of the heavier shoegaze albums, especially of the genre's early years. It takes the noisy and energetic stylings of, early 90s alt rock and even some grunge, to be honest, and twists them into what is, in my opinion, one of the most satisfying shoegaze albums of all time. Even despite the fact that shoegaze music tends to focus so heavily on atmosphere, and sometimes the raw emotion in vocals in shoegaze kind of gets washed away by said atmosphere. But Swervedriver managed to keep both atmosphere and just raw emotion intact throughout. Adam Franklin's vocals throughout just bleed raw angst and energy, and it shines throughout any amount of dense noise and distortion and guitar effects this album is filled to the brim with. It kind of, the emotion on this album definitely kind of acts like the driving force behind everything. And instrumentally, this is one of the tightest shoegaze albums I've ever heard. Despite the sheer amount of texture in the guitar work, I still think it presents a ever-present just atmosphere and energy. The drumming, again, I never mentioned it. The drumming is absolutely amazing as well. It just is relentless. It's just in your face. It's punchy, and it just somehow manages again to just provide so much rawness and angst throughout what is at the same time a very atmospheric and just almost relaxing record at times. It's a bit of an odd juxtaposition, but I think the band manages to somehow pull it off perfectly. It to me is one of the most underappreciated shoegaze albums of all time, and it's just another example of how versatile the genre can be.
Swervedriver for sure have a fairly unique place in shoegaze, as they're another band that heavily utilized the shoegaze sound while also applying it and blending it with other distinct sounds and ideas. And like you mentioned, it's probably one of the heaviest shoegaze albums of the early 90s. In this case, a lot of what Swervedriver does on Mezcal takes from a sound of pure early 90s alt rock, that has a bit of a grunge undertone to it. And while personally I do think that it's a bit derivative, I still think it's a good record that's worth giving a listen. There's a lot of really cool aspects to take away from this album, like the production and the guitar work. I do really like how the band utilized that kind of grunge guitar tone into a more atmospheric setting. It actually reminds me of some of the things that the Smashing Pumpkins did on albums like Siamese Dream and even their debut Gish. There's plenty of energy on this album. I really enjoyed the more noise-tinged production and the shoegaze atmospherics. There's plenty of amazing riffs on this album. The structure and the flow of the album is really good, and there's plenty of really great tracks to be found on here. I can't mention the guitar work enough because it just fucking slams on this album, no doubt. Personally, I wouldn't call Mezcal one of my favorite albums on the list. Personally, I do find it as a tad bit derivative of Ride, if I'm being honest, but even then, it's still a very good album that has some really interesting ideas that go on within the tracks, and it has some absolutely fucking killer guitar work, so that wouldn't be too much of an issue of the album because I still think it's really good. On that merit, though, a lot of what they do is great. I think it's essential. And with that in mind, favorite tracks from Mezcal are Duel, Juris, and You Find It Everywhere. Least favorite track would probably be Abduction.
My favorite tracks are Forsaken Heat, Duel, and Harry and Maggie. My least favorite track is You Find It Everywhere.
Alright, we're moving on to the next album, and they spent their They spent their wild youthful days in the glittering world of the Salons by the Swirlies. That's some title, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is
I love it, though.
Yeah, I like it too. It's a mouthful, though. This is the second full-length album from Boston indie rock and noise pop band Swirlies, and it was released under Tang Records in 1996. We're finally out in 93. Well, hey. Before we compiled this list, I was fairly unfamiliar with Swirlies and their sound. This was the first album of theirs that I was checking out, and I was pretty hyped to give it a listen since I saw the genre tags in RYM. After listening to it, I really like it. I think it's a very good album, and this band has a really interesting approach to their sound. Personally, I don't think it always sticks the landing, but with that in mind, it deserves to be an essential shoegaze record. The band boldly wears their influences on their sleeve, particularly their influences from bands like, obviously, the aforementioned My Bloody Valentine from earlier on, and Sonic Youth, and they use these influences as a way to try and push what they do sonically, and in turn, we get a record that is really colourful and really charming. Production-wise, this thing has a rough charm to it that's shown by the distorted and hazy sound palette. The instrumentation and ideas that the band utilize play well into this palette, and we get a load of really great moments from it. Instrumentally, there's a lot of really playful and complex ideas. It really thrives in that area the most, especially with the combination of its complexity and its playfulness. It's a real selling point from it. And I hate myself for saying this, but it's kind of quirky, if you say so myself. if I do say so myself, goddamn. There's so many fantastic tracks in this album, and they really do act as some of the best tracks that 90s indie rock and shoegaze has to offer. But with that in mind, I don't think it always sticks the landing. There's a few moments that don't really stand out to me, and they just kind of blend in. There is a few ideas that I can appreciate, but they come off a little awkward and kind of poorly executed in some aspects. And while those aspects make it stand out, there are... I guess I don't really see myself listening to them. Like... Hold on, I read that sentence wrong. Holy Jesus. Okay, let me just... There is a few ideas that I can appreciate, but they come off a little awkward and poorly executed. And while those aspects make this album stand out, I don't really see myself listening to this particular album over, say, Loveless or Souvlaki anytime soon. Look, for what it's worth, Swirlies give themselves a unique identity, and in this field, they especially stand out. There's plenty of amazing moments as well, but as I said, it doesn't always stick the landing. Can you tell I'm reading notes?
They spent their wild youthful days explores the noisiest and most dissonant reaches of pop music. This album is vibrant, it's full of life, emotion, and it's wonderfully textured. The process in which this album was made is very interesting to me. The base kind of pop foundations of this project were recorded first, and in a rather short duration of time as well. And then the rest of the textures and noisy soundscapes were slowly and meticulously overdubbed over the course of a year after that. And the result is just one of the most unorthodox yet strangely familiar pop records I've ever heard. It has kind of hints all over the genre spectrum. There's hints of krautrock, noise rock, neo-psychedelia, anything you can think of, it's found here. That may be hyperbolic. The highs on this album are just some of the most cathartic pieces of music of the entire 90s. Sounds of Spring and Two Girls Kissing in particular just stand out above the rest. The melodies are just absolutely sweet. The vocals and vocal harmonies are incredible. Especially the harmonies. What they managed to do here is just so enchanting. And instrumentally, this thing was, very clearly the result of just countless hours of arrangement and hard work, because the structures of everything is just, as I said, so meticulous and just so on point throughout. It's yet another must-hear album for any fan of shoegaze, and another one that is kind of in its own sort of separate field in the shoegaze spectrum. It's definitely a standout for me.
Alright, best or worst tracks. My favourite tracks are Sounds of Sebring, San Cristobal de las Casas, and Two Girls Kissing. My least favourite track is You Can't Be Told It, You Must Behold It.
Exact same as yours. Let's move on.
Okay.
Next up, we have Citrus, the sophomore studio album from American shoegaze band Asobi Seksu, released in May 2006.
Segs.
Six. With this next album, we skip forward in time a whole decade. Shoegaze and music in general just doesn't get much more sweet than Asobi Seksu's Citrus. It's a despite the name, it's rather sweet. It's a sonic journey just through pure musical bliss. The wall of noise present all over these wonderfully cathartic dream pop tracks is like a colorful explosion. Yuki's vocals are just gorgeous. They blend in with the heavenly and ethereal guitar work perfectly. The drumming is also just so tight. And, the whole album just exudes absolutely blissful atmosphere. Not gonna lie, it's definitely not the most complex album. It's far from it, actually. But I think it gets the shoegaze fundamentals just perfectly right, and then some. And then when you mix this with just the sheer perfection this album presents musically, it does really make a really special experience. I think this project takes you on a journey. It's life-affirming. It's impossible not to get lost in its just absolutely dense beauty. And to me, there's just nothing on here to not love. It's one of the most feel-good albums I've ever heard in my life. Yeah, it's definitely one of the highlights of 2000s emo shoegaze.
Emo?
It's definitely not.
You already
emo.
did the emo essentials, damn.
I'm a little late to the party. This is definitely not emo.
Not a chance.
Yeah, it's one of the highlights of shoegaze in the 2000s, for sure.
Citrus is one of the best shoegaze albums out there, honestly. It doesn't exactly reinvent the wheel or do anything that's all that new for shoegaze, but honestly, that doesn't really mean much to me in this case, because what Asobi Seksu do on this album is nothing short of incredible, and there's far too many amazing tracks in this album to not consider it a fucking fantastic album. Citrus is probably the most fun shoegaze album I've ever heard. It's unapologetically poppy, and the music is just so damn infectious. It's a blast to listen to from front to back, and the band just provides so many amazing moments with beautifully textured atmospheres and just infectious instrumentation and hooks. The production is fantastic. The tonally sweet sounds blend with the cacophony of noise and feedback so well. The vocals are great as well. The fun instrumentation sounds fantastic in this colorful palette, and they lend themselves too well to the songs. If there is one track that legit stands out the most on this album, it would honestly have to be Red Sea. That track is legit one of the best shoegaze songs ever made, and it is 7 minutes 45 seconds of pure bliss. I love that track so much. I know a lot of typical shoegaze tends to be fairly melancholic, but this shit is tonally far removed from a lot of that, since it's simply just a really sweet and happy sounding album, and it's just good vibes across the entire thing. There isn't a single moment that is trying to get you down or anything like that. It is just fun as hell. There isn't a single bad song in this album, or even a lackluster one. All of it is just at the very least good. It doesn't drag on, it doesn't blend together. It's just consistent all around, and it's just such a joy of an album. It's honestly up there as one of my favorites on this list, and it's one that I definitely want y'all to listen to if you haven't already. It's just so damn good. Trust. And I don't have much more to say about it. All in all, Citrus is it's just a great album. And favorite tracks from it are Thursday, Strings, and Red Sea. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are Thursday, Strings, and Goodbye. And again, no least favorites.
Alright, and we are moving on to the final 4 albums on our list. And we're going to move on to Souvenirs d'un autre monde from Alcest. This is the debut album from French band Alcest. It came out in 2007 and was released under Prophecy. Now, over the years, plenty of bands have decided to experiment with the shoegaze sound and blend it with other sounds and styles. There's your typical fusions with, say, indie, dream pop, post-punk, post-rock, etc. But when it came to Alcest, they were major pioneers, and their first 2 albums are pretty influential and really unique, since they were basically crossing over shoegaze with black metal, and this fusion would become its own thing, with the genre now being known as black gaze today. Black gaze is fairly controversial. Fairly controversial, mostly because true cult black metal nerds will bitch and moan about it being quote unquote hipster black metal and fake black metal, whatever the fuck that means. But either way, they can go fuck themselves, because black gaze is great, and Alcest's debut is one of the best black gaze records ever. This album is just beautiful. The way that it blends shoegaze's atmosphere with black metal instrumentation is just mind-blowing to me. Black metal has always had an atmosphere to it, but Alcest took it into new territories with what they were doing. I really like the post-rock dynamics of this album too, and the way the songs build out. I really love the vocals, I love the guitar work, and I really love the moments that kind of delve into territories that sound like dream pop unapologetically. And the array of influences and ideas that the band were working with really made themselves stand out in the genre, and in turn they spawned a new wave of musicians that did the black gaze sound, particularly bands like Death Heaven. And the music speaks for itself, really, because it's just gorgeous across the board. The sound is great. There's plenty of great tracks on here. I love how the band utilize these ideas, and there's just some fucking gorgeous moments to be found. All in all, this is a really great album on its own, but it's also one of the most, I suppose, quote-unquote, experimental shoegaze albums ever made, because of what it blends and what it tries to do, and in turn, Alcest are just pioneers for black gaze.
Yeah, we definitely move on to quite an interesting album, and as you said, we peek into one of shoegaze's most notable subgenres, black gaze. And this is an album from the one and only godfather of black gaze, Jesus Christ. There's a black case, what's in it? Nija, if that's how you pronounce it. And more specifically, his Alcest project. And, although black gaze really rose to prominence with Death Heaven, its roots can easily be traced back to Alcest, and quite, specifically this album, being, their debut album, it really kind of is a catalyst for everything that came after it. However, to me personally, it really is a bit of a stretch to call this project black gaze. It doesn't really quite compare to the black gaze we know today. It, to me, is more of a shoegaze album with just heavy post-metal and black metal influences, and it's absolutely gorgeous. What would you know? Let's move away from talking about black gaze. That could be a separate episode. Who knows? But the best way I could describe this album is just beauty and hope, but wrapped in a shroud of just unsettling melancholy. It features a lot of elements one would usually expect from a shoegaze album, but at its core, it heavily, again, borrows from post-metal. It's, in its both complex instrumentation, in its almost overwhelming atmosphere building. The reason I kind of hesitate to classify this album as straight up black gaze album is it just is too gentle, and I think the dream pop and the shoegaze just really takes center stage on this project. Some of the instrumentation definitely is very harsh, but the vocal work is just absolutely sweet. Again, almost dream pop-esque at times. The walls of sound, consuming this album are just so lush, so soothing. It doesn't really have much in terms of black metal, but it does have, as I said, quite a bit of post metal, especially in how it builds its atmospheres and builds up towards these just overwhelming peaks. It's just one of the most interesting albums we'll be talking about today, just because of the juxtaposition between its genres. Metal and dream pop on one album, kind of an odd combination, but it really works amazingly here. So much so that it did kind of lead to the formation of quite a notable subgenre of shoegaze. It's an amazing album. It's one of my favorites on this list, and fantastic.
The black metal influences definitely break out more on their second album.
Yeah, I've heard. I haven't heard that one actually, but I definitely heard.
It's really good, but I prefer this one. Alright, and with
what
that in
tracks
mind,
do you prefer?
I prefer the title track, Les Iris, and I'm about to butcher this because I cannot speak French. Sur l'autre rive j'ai t'attendrai. Fuck. And worst track, Tirnanog.
Oh god. Printemps Emerald, Souvenirs d'un autre monde, and Celerant. I don't really have any of these favorite tracks.
Oh shit, what's the next one then?
Moving on to another fucking behemoth. Deathconsciousness, which is the debut studio album by American duo Have a Nice Life. Released with the expectation of lingering in obscurity, the album has since gained widespread acclaim on places like 4chan and Radio Music. Death Conscious is one of the albums of all time. It just so happens to also be one of my favorite albums of all time. Yet another one of those on the list.
Okay, people, get the popcorn out again.
There's no other project on this list, even the one that spawned a subgenre of black metal that is as dark as this album. Everyone knows this is like the most black-pilled doomer album of all time, and I fucking love it. Death Consciousness is incredibly, and I mean incredibly lo-fi. The majority of this album was recorded on a pinhole mic on Dan Barrett's laptop. Yet, despite its very low recording quality, the sound of this album is just absolutely vast and enormous. The soundscapes on this album, they're not like the vast ethereal and heavenly walls of sound present on a lot of shoegaze, but instead this album sounds very hollow, misanthropic, and just very nocturnal. But the dark and brutally ominous atmosphere still conjure up some incredibly beautiful and powerful imagery. Bloodhail, one of the most haunting tracks of all time. The atmosphere of that song is just so dark, it's unbelievable. Earth Mover, my favorite album closer of all time. That one moment, you all know the one I'm talking about, is just music at its most powerful. It just sends shivers down my entire body every single time. It is fucking insane and so dark as well. This album is just life-affirmingly incredible. It's industrial, it's dark and grim from start to finish, but it presents all its very dark themes in such a poignant, beautiful way. And in a way that almost anyone could relate to. It's an absolute masterpiece.
Well then, Death Consciousness. Safe to say it's a bit of a sad album.
Yeah.
Who am I kidding? Who am I fucking kidding? You'll be basically left as an emotional wreck after the album is done. Jesus Christ. Dan Barrett and Tim Makuga are the two names behind Have a Nice Life, and they pretty much created a one-of-a-kind album. An album that stands out as its own beast, and it's an album that is one of the greatest albums of the 2000s. Death Consciousness is a hard enough album to talk about as a shoegaze album because, simply put, it's just so much more than that. There's so much more that goes on with the album stylistically and musically. It just goes beyond shoegaze, really, with that into consideration. Hell, it's even one of those albums that just goes beyond music, as cringe as it is to say, because there just isn't anything like it that I can think of. It's really its own beast, as I said. That it has its own sound and its own dark way of conveying hopelessness. The album pulls from a lot of different sounds, since it's on the shoegaze essentials. There's influences from shoegaze, and especially the textures and tones that it takes from. And there's post-punk instrumentation at points, there's drone pieces, there's a lot of gothic textures, and they're turned into this cohesive piece that all culminates under this very lo-fi setting and the pure melancholic bleakness that it resides in. And it sounds incredible from front to back. It still blows me away that this album was only made by 2 people. Like, what? How the fuck? And given, like, the way it was recorded and the way it, like, basically how it was recorded, like the way you mentioned, and just the way it just creates this soundscape, like, it's insane to me. There's just, like, no words to describe it, really. There are moments in this album that will just send you to another plane of existence. They act as, like, some of the most otherworldly and cathartic tracks that I've ever heard, and some of the greatest songs of all time are on this album for me. no doubt. It's long enough for sure. It definitely demands a lot from the listener, and while I personally feel like a couple of tracks are a bit forgettable, the album makes up for it with the amount of just incredible and mind-blowing material that's on it. I still remember the very first time I heard this album. Yours truly got me to listen to it. We both listened to it in college. And when Earth Mover came on, like, oh no. Like, it fucking killed me. He's a witness. He can attest to this.
Yeah.
I think we both looked at each other at the moment that moment in Earth Mover goes, and we're like, fuck.
Yeah, I was left this plane of existence.
I was literally on fucking Mars at that point. Well, lecturer must have thought we were on fucking crack or something. It was so funny. Yeah, anyways, Deathconsciousness is just a fucking beast of an album. It's its own beast. It's just a really unique album that has its own sound, and I can barely think of anything that sounds like it. And I think it's an incredible album. And if you're going to listen to it, be prepared to be an emotional wreck afterward. And that in mind, my favorite tracks from Deathconsciousness are A Quick One Before the Eternal Worm Devours Connecticut, Blood Hail, and Earth Mover. My least favorite track is Telephony.
My favorite track is Blood Hail, I Don't Love, and Earth Mover, and I don't have any least favorite tracks.
Alright, we're moving on to Eureka by Kinoko Teikoku. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the debut album from Japanese indie rock and shoegaze band Kinoko Teikoku. This album came out in 2013 and was released under Daizawa Records. We're slowly catching up to our point in time, and Eureka is another love shoegaze record that came out more recently, I'd say. Recent is a bit of a stretch though, since it came out nearly 10 years ago, but you know, it's whatever. Eureka is a very good album. It has a lot of things that I can appreciate about it. Wouldn't call it one of my favorites on the list, but it's still a thoroughly enjoyable album. Like I said, wouldn't be one of my favorites on the list, but it's still a worthwhile shoegaze album that has some fantastic tracks, fantastic production, and just really cool moments and ideas. Eureka isn't reinventing the wheel for shoegaze. The indie rock shoegaze crossover has been, it's kind of hard to make refreshing, and while there are moments on Eureka where that's the case, there are tracks and moments on here that are really cool and really enjoyable. I enjoy the subtle post-rock elements, I like a lot of the J-rock elements, and sonically this thing is pretty great. Production is great, vocals are great, and there's just some really transcendental songs on here. Like I said, it doesn't really reinvent the wheel or anything, and it has moments that aren't all that interesting to me. But with the amount of material on here that I think is really good, it makes it a really enjoyable album. And honestly, I don't have much else to say besides that. I don't particularly find it to be one of the more out there releases, especially on this list, but it's still a really enjoyable album that I'd recommend. And as a more recent record, I think it's definitely worth noting.
Yeah, I wouldn't say this is an album that clicked with me immediately, because from first listen, you know, while I could appreciate that this was just a gorgeous album, it still to me kind of felt quite safe. But it was only after, you know, checking it out a few times that the album's magic really made itself evident to me, and this project began to really resonate with me. You know, as I mentioned before, this album is a little on the safer side. There's nothing here that's in like any real way experimental or truly forward thinking. But while, you know, it does keep its shoegaze aspects within a relatively tried and tested space, I think its beauty and poignancy, you know, it just isn't immediately apparent. It again took a few listens for me to really connect with this album on an emotional level, but I'm at the point now where I can say tracks like Cockadoo Slope or Another Word are just some of the most powerfully and emotionally grandiose songs of the entire 2010s. Chiaki Sato's vocals carry such, you know, beautifully sentimental yet tortured emotion. The songs here are equal parts atmospheric meditations and just indie rock earworms, and the instrumentation manages to create a dense and mystic beauty almost out of thin air, as this thing is, you know, as I said, nowhere nearly as complex as some of the other albums we've talked about, and the sound palette is, you know, nothing compared to something like Loveless and Souvlaki. But I really don't think this album needed to be any more complex or diverse than it is. Despite some of my initial reservations, because, what this album does do right is it creates a space for you to just escape reality and lose yourself in the beauty of the world around you for 47 minutes. I think this project is just quite simply gorgeous. And yeah, it's another absolute standout and essential for me.
Alright. I completely forgot to translate these tracks, so I have to say the track numbers instead for best to worst tracks. My favorite tracks are the 4th track, the 5th track, and the 8th track. If I had to pick a least favorite, I'd go with the 6th track.
My favorite tracks are Kokudo Slope, Another Word, and Ashita ni wa Subate go Uwaru do Shite.
Oh my god.
My least favorite track is Fukasuri Kyoshitsu. There we go.
There you go.
And now we move forward in time another almost decade, and we arrive at last year. Next up is To See the Next Part of the Dream, the sophomore studio album by South Korean musician Parannoul, released independently in February 2021. Despite only being released last year, To See the Next Part of the Dream is one of my favorite albums of all time. It's one of my select few Perfect 10 albums. I'm not sure how to put into words just how much this record blew me away on first listen, and still does. Parannoul is easily one of the most exciting artists releasing music today, in my opinion. I fucking love shoegaze. I also love emo. Combine those two and you've already got my attention, but what Parannoul does with that attention is just take me on an absolutely breathtaking journey through his psyche. The instrumental work is just so complete, so dense and gorgeous, and the hazy atmospheres created here are beyond mesmerizing. The vocals just sound so human and pained, and when you read through the translations, you realize just how heartbreaking and deeply scarred the lyrics are. They add just so much weight to the music, and the fact that every single instrument on here is digital is really quite impressive. There's nothing this album does wrong in my eyes. It's absolutely elating. It feels like a beautifully sentimental daydream in music form, and it just taps into feelings of just such deep nostalgia for me, and nostalgia for a time that was long before this album was even released. It just kind of connects with you in a magical way. It's just universal, I think. It's a beautiful album.
Yeah, To See the Next Part of the Dream is an album that only came out over a year ago. It cropped up out of nowhere on RYM, and since then, the South Korean artist has become a recent favourite amongst fans of shoegaze and emo, and it's easy to see why, since To See the Next Part of the Dream is a great album that acts as one of the most beautiful and significant shoegaze albums in recent memory. A lot of the genre blends in this album are fairly typical with your underground shoegaze releases. Parannoul ties together shoegaze with emo, post-rock, post-hardcore, which is then tied together with lo-fi instrumentation, digital instrumentation, might add, and soundscapes, which culminates into a gorgeous album that is really energetic and cathartic, but it can bring a tear to your eye. It's insane that what was made in here was just made by one person. Every bit of raw instrumentation is just passionate, and you can tell that the passion is there with how the album plays out. The way that the vocals play into the atmospheres and the instrumentation is just great. I love the dynamic songwriting, and that just makes it all the more engaging as well. And like you mentioned, if you read into the lyrics, it's a very dark listen if you're reading the lyrics on Bandcamp. It deals with so much, and it makes sense with the soundtrack, and not soundtrack, soundscapes, and with it being a more emo tinged release. There's tracks in here that are just out of this world. They act as some of the most beautiful songs you will ever hear in this sound, and they are just some of the most cathartic and beautiful songs that I've heard in recent memory, especially moments like Beautiful World and Analog Sentimentalism. This album is great. The only real issue I ever really had with it is the same ones that I had when I first listened to it, and it's that I don't find it as unique with the styles it incorporates, and some tracks are a bit too long-winded towards the back end. Well, that's it. Aside from that, this album is great, and it's one that I would definitely recommend. It's, for sure, it was one of my favorite albums of 2021, and it still remains that way for me. And with that in mind, best tracks from To See the Next Part of the Dream are Beautiful World, Analog Sentimentalism, and Youth Rebellion. My least favorite track is Excuse.
My favorite tracks are Beautiful World, Analog Sentimentalism, and Chicken, and I do not have any of these favorite tracks.
And with that in mind, we did it! We talked about Shoegaze! Woo! Where's this going? Nah. I don't know. What is going on? I don't know. Nothing. Wow, this outro is
musical outro.
This outro is so scuffed. Oh my god. Yeah. Anyways, actual outro time. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Shoegaze Essentials. We really hope that you enjoyed, and we really hope that you get to check out some of these albums because obviously we recommend them. Mm-hmm. Of course, we want to mention shout outs to our patrons. We want to shout out May, our tier 5 patron. And we want to shout out Joshua as well. Tier 2? Is that right?
1 or 2.
1 or 2. Still.
Tier 1 for 3 or 4 months, I think. So
based as fuck still. Thank you very much, Joshua and May. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
And of course, if y'all want to support us, our Patreon is in the description. You can check out some perks there. And of course, you could join our Discord server as well, just to chat with us and chat with a bunch of like-minded individuals about music and whatever. Links to our own Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages will be in the description, as well as our own individual YouTube channels that we barely post on. And with that in mind, my name is MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Bye!
Peace and love.